However, before we start getting to know all the principles of cascading, I would like us to understand what inheritance in CSS is. Inheritance is a very important topic regarding cascading in CSS. I'd like us to cover some issues well in order to have a solid foundation on how exactly CSS cascading works. Before we discuss the principles of cascading, we need to know what inheritance in CSS is. Inheritance is when the value of one property of a parent element is assigned to the same property of another element. Inheritance always happens directly from the parent element to the child element and only affects part of the properties. Some properties are inherited, others are not. On this slide, we can see an example of inheriting the font size property from the body element to the P element that is just inside the body element. The body element is the parent of the P element, and as a child, the P element will inherit the font size property of 20 pixels from its parent. We already know that even if we don't assign a font size property to the P element, the browser will create it anyway. The only question is which value will it assign to it. We already know the initial values, the default browser styles values, but the values can also be inherited, as in this case. Only some properties are inherited. Inheritance applies only when there is no rule with a given property that matches the element. Inheritance always takes place from the parent element to the child element. We don't have to memorize which properties are inherited and which are not. It is just a matter of practice. You will see that you will find out intuitively which and why some properties are inherited and others are not. It doesn't matter that much, because inheritance only works when we don't assign specific rules to the specific elements by ourselves. And as the web developers, this is what we will do most of the time. Directly assigning a value to a particular element excludes inheritance. We should also remember that inheritance always takes place directly from a parent to a child, not from a further descendant. Of course, a certain element may inherit a property from a further descendant, but only if its parent inherited this property and our element inherited from the parent. As we can see it on this slide, we have a p tag with some text, which is a child of a body tag, which is a child of the HTML tag. We can see that the text transform property is inherited, but the background color and margin are not inherited. As I said, there's no need to memorize it, and you will see that in practice, it will all become clear and understandable why some properties are inherited and the others are not. But how do we know which properties are inherited, and is it very important? Where can we find this information? We do not need to memorize this, but it is worth remembering that we can always check it in a documentation. Just Google the name of a certain CSS property, and in the search results you will definitely find the links to W3 schools and developer Mozilla pages, where we have, for example, CSS background color property. We can scroll a little bit down, and we have these information. And what is the most important for us at this moment is that default value, where we can see it's transparent, and if it's inherited, and we can see it's not. And you can find out this info for all the CSS properties. But above the inheritance, we also have such thing as precision. On this slide, you can see the p tag with some text, which is a child of a body, which is a child of the HTML tag. And we define the font size of the body tag for 30 pixels. So since we didn't build a CSS rule for our p tag, it will inherit 30 pixels from its parent, which is the body tag. We will see it later in practice. But on this slide, you can see that we assigned 20 pixels precisely for our p tag. So now the inheritance won't work, because precision is always more important than inheritance. If we didn't assign these 20 pixels precisely to the p tag, it would inherit the font size from the body tag, which would be 30 pixels. But since we build the CSS rule precisely for our P element, it will get the font size precisely assigned to it. As I said, inheritance only works from the parent element. On this slide, we assign a font size of 30 pixels to our HTML element. What do you think? How much will the P tag have? Of course, it will inherit this value, but let's get this straight. It will inherit it from the body tag, which is its parent, only because the body tag inherited from its parent, which is the HTML tag. If the body tag would have assigned a different value to it, our P tag would inherit the value from the body tag, because inheritance only works from the parent to the child element. So how the browser will do it? First, it will assign a font size property of 30 pixels to the HTML element. Remember that it has to assign the values to the other properties as well. It will assign the font size property of 30 pixels to the body element under the inheritance, because the child inherits from the parent. Then the P tag will inherit it as well from its parent, which is the body tag. The P tag inherited from its parent, which is the body, and the body inherited from its parent, which is the HTML element. I would like us to see it now in practice. Then it will all become simple and understandable. So let's get to work.